All right, well, welcome to the second in this series of Portraying History. Today we're going to be looking at the consecration of Napoleon and the coronation of the Empress Josephine in 1804. 2000, in fact, the 5th of May 2021 marks the 200th anniversary of the death of Napoleon Bonaparte on the island of St. Helena after 7 years imprisonment by the British. Now, although he never gave up the idea that he could possibly escape, he did spend those last years of his life dictating his memoirs. And the book which would result from this, the Memoirs of St. Helena, written by Lascaux, one of his devoted disciples, would go on to be one of the bestsellers of the 19th century. And the ideas in it would in many ways dominate or affect the politics of the very long 19th century. Now, why I'm mentioning this is because it means that Napoleon is continuing what he always had done, which was create his own image, create his own myth and create his own legend. This time, of course, it had to be by words, as he no longer had access to a team of painters. Now, what we're going to look at today then is this legend that in part was created by the Memorial of St. Helena and continued today by the painting, which is probably one of the best known in the Louvre. After the Mona Lisa, everybody goes to see the coronation of Napoleon. And after the marriage at Cana, it is the second biggest painting there, with figures of Napoleon being almost life-size. It's very important, I think, historically, because it marks the moment when Bonaparte, in other words, the General Bonaparte, the first Consul Bonaparte, becomes Napoleon, the Emperor Napoleon. And it's from this point onwards that he calls himself Napoleon. Up until then, it's incorrect to call him that. He is Bonaparte. So here we have the moment when he transitions from being, or officially transitions from being part of a revolutionary or directorial government and becomes an emperor in his own right. Now, this painting has 191 figures in it, many of them portraits, and it gives us an idea of exactly what we think. It gives us an idea of what went on at this momentous affair. I want to investigate, look at what Napoleon was attempting to do with this image, and it's actually more complicated than it actually looks on the surface. It took David, who was the painter who would be devoted to Napoleon, who saw Napoleon a kind of savior, an extraordinary person. It took David 3 years to finish, as you can imagine, with all of these portraits and all of the reproduction of costumes and so on. And it was displayed in the Louvre. Here we have a painting of the painting being admired in the Louvre. The Louvre was open on Sundays, free for citizens to come and admire it. Now, this in many ways then was, I suppose, the Instagram, more or less, of the time. This was Napoleon's savvy use of propaganda. He knew, as he said very pithily, that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I'm going to be depicting Napoleon as someone who always looked and worked outside the box, whether it was from the point of view of military campaigns or conceptually with urban planning or his ideas of religion. But one thing that we're going to study particularly today is his use of propaganda in art. Now, right from the very beginning of his career, he was aware of the importance of promoting an image. It wasn't just simply enough to do. You had to spread the word, so as to speak, and the word wasn't as easy as that to spread. It was much better to have pictures. These pictures would be then turned into engravings and could then be sent out to different marketplaces and would disseminate throughout the empire. Indeed, it was very much like the Roman emperor's use of coins. So here we have Napoleon, as you know, who was born into sort of minor nobility in Corsica, is educated as a scholarship boy in France, and his career is perfectly timed for someone of his talent. It's the time of the revolution, when the revolutionary army is setting out to conquer Europe, or to put to stop the other monarchs of Europe from invading France. And he rises through the ranks very rapidly, because the aristocrats had either been sent into exile or were being executed. So there is room in the army for talented people and for self-made men, as indeed he was. Now, he participates in the campaign against Italy, and this particular battle was the battle at the bridge of Arcola against the Austrians. The French were trying to get rid of the Austrians. Napoleon was in charge of some battalions which were trying to cross the river to isolate the Austrians on the other side, with the idea of actually eventually taking Milan, which he successfully would do. And it came at a critical point where the army, or his battalion, had to cross the river and were stalled because of enemy fire. Napoleon grabs the flag of the Republic and goes across. Well, this is what he wants to represent in the painting anyhow. He actually did grab the flag and was about to go across when he is pulled to the side by one of his aides-de-corps and actually slips a bit in the mud. We don't actually get this here. What we have is Napoleon's take on it. And he said to the artist, I want myself in the center of this painting. And in fact, you can't see any other soldier on the horizon at all. It is all about this charismatic young general. His face is framed by the flag of the French Revolution, and it's between the flag of the Revolution and the sash of the Revolution. He has the flag in one hand and the saber, or the sword, in the other. In other words, he is the sword, the general, the man who is going to fight for the revolution. He shows himself as still in the storm. You have the vertical of his body, but the turn of his head, looking back sternly to his men, come, follow me, almost like a Christ-like figure. So he is the romantic hero as well, the beginning of romanticism, this man, young man with his hair flying in the wind, just like the flag. So you have all of nature, the smoke and the flags and everything in turmoil, but the steady center of it is the General Bonaparte. Now, that is incorrectly written there, Napoleon. It should be Bonaparte at the siege of Arcola. He came back, and some people are still not muted. He came back from this campaign and realized that he needed to keep himself in the front of people's consciousness, and so orchestrates a massive campaign off to Egypt with the idea of trying to cut off the British trade routes, which some of which came from India through Egypt. He goes off, as he will, with the Bourdin voyage to Australia, with not just an army, but with scientists, archaeologists, botanists, astronomers, geologists, a very scientific expedition. And he wishes to bring back relics or sort of ideas from this. In other words, our glorious republic goes even into Egypt. So here you see in this particular painting the flag of the French Republic in the background. His problem was that Nelson scuttled his fleet at Aboukir. He had to then continue inland. He pulled off a number of victories, but unfortunately the plague set in on his army. So knowing that he had to actually get back to France, if indeed he was to keep claiming that position that he wanted, which was to become the leader of France, if indeed he had not already the idea of becoming emperor, he knew that he had to retreat back to the coast and then leave. He couldn't do this with a number of dead and dying, and so it is thought that he gave them overdoses of opium. Now, when he comes back, he needs to actually recreate a much better image of this, and it's the image that is going to create our great Bonaparte in Egypt, the great conqueror of the East. And so here he has himself dressed in his general's uniform, accompanied by doctors who are looking horrified, as you can see, as he touches the bubo, or the glands underneath the arm of one of the sufferers. So this is clearly this idea of the magic touch of the kings of France. We know that, and this is exactly what he is going to want to do. He's going to want to take over the images of the dynasties of France, but also it is a Christ-like gesture, of healing the sick. So here you have this mixture of the exotic, the healing and the courage of this young man, as we see the doctors who are horrified and holding up handkerchiefs because they know, or they think, that viruses are transmitted through the air, which is quite an interesting idea at the moment, of course, with COVID. So this painting then goes on show at the Louvre, and again we have one of Napoleon's pithy statements: history is a set of lies agreed upon. Couldn't be truer at the present moment. So when he comes back, and also during the time that he will be in power, which is until 1814, he constantly reminds people of his conquests or so-called conquests in the East. And you have, from the point of view of urban planning, you have the Châtelet fountain, which is enormous, with these sphinxes recalling Egypt. You have a whole, up near the Sentier, up near the Boulevard Saint-Denis, you have a whole little area where the streets are named after his conquests in the East, Aboukir, and so on. And also the Passage du Caire, where you actually have the front of it looks like an Egyptian temple. He also goes to Sèvres and commissions a number of dinner sets and tea sets, coffee sets, which commemorate his campaign, as you can see here, with the paraphernalia of Egypt. And these would be offered as presents to other monarchs and sent throughout the empire as this idea of the hegemony of France. He even employs Josephine, who was the fashionista of the time, who makes turbans, the Eastern turbans fashionable, and also with these enormous ostrich feathers. So he has sort of basically all visual images covered of this idea of the return from Egypt style. Now, not as soon as he comes back from Egypt, he's been told that it's a moment when he can actually come to power. He plots to overthrow the government of the time. Now, the government of the time was something which had come after the death of Robespierre. When Robespierre is overturned, a government called the Directory, which I won't go into, comes into power, which is weak, somewhat corrupt, doesn't have much power, and Bonaparte realizes that he can take control. So he works with some of his generals, works up a coup d'etat, and this is a famous one of the 18th Brumaire. This is used these words are used for the months of the revolutionary calendar, Brumaire being part of a winter month. He sends words that there is a Jacobin plot which is trying to come back and, you know, bring back the reign of terror, and that the two, the Council of 500 and the Council of the Ancients, les Anciens, which are the two sort of parliamentary figures, I suppose, groups, must be moved out to Saint-Cloud for their own safety. In fact, he does that so that he can isolate them and then intimidate them. And so he then goes and makes speeches saying that, you know, the Republic is in danger. You need me. It needs a strong team to keep it alive. Now, he didn't have too much trouble with one group, but the Council of 500 rebelled against him and started shouting, you know, outlaw, outlaw. And it was basically up to his brother, who we see up here, Lucien, who was a very skilled orator, who manages to steal the show and to actually manage to free Bonaparte, who was being set upon by these senators, and gives him enough time to have Murat, his great general, come in with the army and succeed and finish off the coup d'etat. So it was a bit shaky, and he relied very much on his brother Lucien, and he will have a lot of rivalry with this brother, who was a very talented man. We don't know whether he ever would have been a general, but he actually wrote a number of poems. He was interested in archaeology and ends up going into exile in Rome, and will not be at Napoleon's coronation. Napoleon then sets up the consulate. Now, the consulate, of course, based on the ancient Roman system of government, but here he sets himself up with as one of three. He's not ready to show his hand as being the supreme leader. So here we have Lebrun over here, Napoleon in the center, and Cambacérès over here. And people are under absolutely no illusions that he will be first consul. So he then has himself elected as first consul, and then first consul for life. So in other words, he is doing very much as the leader of China has virtually done as well. Now, it's at this time in 1797 that David, who had been a rabid member of the revolutionary government and had voted for the death of the king, meets Bonaparte and is absolutely entranced, wouldn't be quite the right word, but sees in him the ancient Roman type. And even though he can only have a very short sitting with him, manages to sketch in this rather commanding painting of the young Bonaparte, still with his long hair, but still in this contrapposto position, looking off into the great distance, not at us, looking out into the future. So Bonaparte still goes immediately, takes his army off to again fight the Austrians in Italy. And this time he pulls off another one of his unusual sort of military tactics, which was to force march his army across the St. Bernard Pass in winter. And this was a very difficult maneuver, of course. You had to pull the cannons on sleds. The horses quite possibly would have died because they slipped. So he turns now to David, who will become his official painter, and the sort of, not the court painter, but the official painter of Bonaparte, and then as of the emperor. And he says to David, I want myself on a charging horse pointing over the Alps. And David sets this out perfectly to the likings of Bonaparte. So what you have here is a horse which had already been donated to him by one of the, I think it was the leader, the King of Spain had given him this. You have Bonaparte as a charismatic leader. You have the swirling nature of the wind and the swirling mane of the horse, and the figure of Bonaparte is a little bit narrow for this, and so you have this cloak swirling upwards. So in other words, he's a kind of force of nature going up in this extraordinary diagonal over and up the Alps. Now, as in that first propaganda painting, you don't see too much of the army. You get this little glimpse of someone over here, and a reference to the fact that it was damn difficult having to pull things on sleds and pull cannons. So, but what it is all about me. Again, I'm in the center of this central figure with everything else going up on a diagonal. And down here, he is trying to already write himself into history. You actually have Charlemagne, you have Hannibal, of course, who brought the elephants across the Alps, and then Bonaparte. So written in stone is his pedigree. Now, there's more than that written into this painting. He was aware, and David was aware of the importance of a mounted rearing horse. It was the sign of royalty or of a great general. Here we have Velasquez Guzman on horseback. So that is already inscribed in this painting, but also inscribed in it is the great figure Alexander the Great. Now, Napoleon wanted to sort of fashion himself on the figure of Alexander and of Julius Caesar. So here we have on one of the sarcophagus, in fact, Alexander's sarcophagus, he's riding in exactly the same position. If you can see, he's bareback, but it's the same position as his legs. Now, the British, of course, in their propaganda at the time, and continues even today, sort of say, look, if he's riding like this, it means that he actually can't ride because he doesn't have his feet in the stirrups in the right position. Well, first of all, there's that reference to Alexander, but also he was an excellent horseman, Napoleon. He'd ridden horses up and down the very difficult terrain of Corsica all his life, and was renowned for his ability to wheel back and forth across the battlefield. So this again is another one of these legends about Napoleon. He had the painting done several times with different horses and had it sent to different courts and to different parts of France. I just wanted to very briefly talk about the horse. I mean, the other thing that the British always say is, oh, ho, ho, he was on a small horse because he was a small man. He was on an Arab, which he brought back from Egypt, and which was a smaller horse than, of course, a thoroughbred or a charger. And the reason he rode this was because this horse was incredibly maneuverable. And even the Duke of Wellington sort of said, you know, Napoleon's presence on the battlefield is worth 4 battalions. He was someone who could incite and encourage his troops. He was everywhere on the battlefield. This little horse was wounded several times. He was present at the Great Battle of Marengo, the Great Battle of Austerlitz, Battle of Jena, Wagram, and of course at Waterloo, when the poor thing was captured by the British and ended up in the British Museum as a skeleton, and which is, I think, is now being repaired because it's disintegrating. When the Bourbons come back into power after the end of the reign of Napoleon, they also do a version of Napoleon crossing the Alps, which is him on a mule, looking rather sort of sad, dilapidated, not at all the way he wanted himself depicted. He also had himself depicted in this position. He loved this painting, as you can imagine. It's the one we still see today. He had it reproduced on Sèvres vases and on Sèvres dinner sets, which were transportable, and on snuff boxes, which you could give away as presents. He's now first consul and turns to the school of David. Now, Gros was one of David's pupils. And here you have Napoleon again. I want myself in the center. He's in a room. He's this upright figure, again turned, looking away into the future, out of the room. His sword is sheathed here. He's no longer on the battlefield. He's a great administrator, and he's here pointing to the treaties. And here he is as the administrator with pen. He's pointing to the Treaty of Lunéville, which actually then brought on the great Treaty of Amiens with Great Britain, and in other words, signifies peace. So here he has himself depicted as the man of peace. He was still only first consul at this point, but already had the idea that he wanted to become the supreme ruler. The problem was that he was targeted by two different groups who wanted him out of the way. First of all, the Bourbons, who we saw last week, by now under the leadership of Louis XVIII in exile, and also the resurgent groups of the Jacobins, who wanted to bring back the revolution, which they thought no longer existed, even under the consulate of Bonaparte. And so there were a number of attempts of his life. This one at the Rue Nicaise, where a machine infernale, a bomb, made of a barrel filled with dynamite, was set off as he was going to the opera. They can't quite work out why they missed their target. Either it was because Josephine was late as usual and the bomb went off before he actually got there, or more likely, I think that they took a slightly different route, and the person who was supposed to pull the cord of the bomb couldn't actually see where he was. Anyhow, you get a rather fanciful view of people jumping in the air. There are a number of people who were killed, but not Napoleon. So Napoleon then conceived of the idea that if he were killed, which was quite a possibility, he wanted to bequeath his legacy, which was considerable. By now he had conquered very much part of Europe and had started reforming most of the state ideas, the legal system, the university system, the ambulance system, the banking system, had all were being put in place. He wanted this to continue, and he wanted it to continue under his own dynasty, who he thought would be the Napoleonites. So he brings in David. This is where he is going to, I just want to talk a little bit about David's pedigree. Now, David is known as the great painter of neoclassicism. He had competed 3 times for the prize of Rome at the Salon. This was a prize which allowed you to go to Rome for 5 years. And he finally won it, but sort of had it in for the directors of the Salon because they, made him wait so long to get it. And we'll see this has an effect later on. He goes to Rome and is very impressed, of course, by ancient Roman ruins and Rome in general, and sends out these 2 famous paintings, which I haven't time to look at in detail, but which are commissioned by aristocrats at the time. But David decides that he wants to instill in them these new ideas of the Enlightenment. And so you have here this idea of oath taking, and this is a very important point that we're going to see. Here you have the 3 Hurati who are pledging on the sword of their father to kill the 3 champions of the Curati, who one of whom is engaged to a sister, and so on. So you have this all together, virility, courage, strength, republican virtue. He also paints just on the time of the revolution, another great idea of devotion to fatherland, devotion to virtue and duty above one's ties of emotion. Here we have Brutus, the great senator, who has condemned to death his sons because they had plotted against the Republic. So on one side, you have the emotional reaction of women, and on the other side of this column, you have the dead bodies and the angst, but the stoicism of Brutus, who refuses to grieve people who have gone against the sacred ideas of revolution and republic. And you can see by his feet, which are sort of taut around each other, how much his inner angst is existing. Now, these gestures that we saw were very important because at 1791, Estates General, 1789 actually, are brought together by Louis XVI. This is when you get the nobles, the people, and the clergy brought together. to work out some new system of monarchy. The people are shut out of it, and they go to the royal tennis court nearby and take the oath to say, we will never go out from here until we have a new constitution. So here you have this idea of people taking oaths, again, a very, very important part in his early paintings. Now, he didn't ever, the reason it's in that sepia version is that he didn't ever have enough time to finish it or enough money, and also because the people in it constantly were being executed. And by the time he actually did that in 1791, people who he had exalted had become considered traitors. Anyway, David becomes a very close friend and ally of Robespierre, who is, of course, you know, the most extreme of the Jacobins. And David then is put in charge of the propaganda and the organization of the festivals of the revolution. And it also means that he takes over the organization of the fine arts section of the Louvre. So in other words, he gets his revenge against the people who sort of didn't think his work was worthwhile. The first of these ceremonies that he produces is the reburying of the body of Voltaire, Voltaire being the great writer and the philosopher of the Enlightenment, on which the revolutionary ideas were based. His body is being taken to the Pantheon, which is now going to enshrine the great men of France. So he has this idea of bodies of Hercules. You have white horses. It's one of David's first great choreographies, where he is in charge of uniforms, of the déroulement, what's the word, the procession and the ceremony. And it's a little bit later that he then becomes also the official painter of the martyrs of the revolution. And here, of course, you would know this painting very well, the death of Marat, who is killed by a royalist, Charlotte Corday. And the Jacobins say, David, you have to do it. And he says, I will, you know, this is my sort of sacred duty. And so he produces this amazing painting where you have nothing in the background. And then this Christ-like figure, almost with the Pietà sort of draped over the side of the bath, which it makes it look a bit like over the side of the tomb, with the sort of stigmata, which is actually where, you know, the wound was inflicted. A Christ-like figure who is killed even as he's writing, you know, saying, give money to these poor people. And of course, you have this very much like a tombstone. So not just ready to actually have this painting hung in the room of the Cordeliers, the Jacobins. He also organizes the body, the funeral of Marat. Now, Marat, as you can see in that painting, has alabaster skin. In fact, of course, he had the most disgusting skin disease, which he'd contracted when he was living in the sewers because he was trying to escape the Bourbon spies before the revolution. And so his body was decomposing very, very rapidly. And so David had very little time to actually conceptualize, again, another extraordinary funeral. This has actually disappeared. This is why it's not a very good reproduction. So we now have David in charge of these massive happenings which are going to take place at the time of the revolution. Now, in 1790, you have the Feast of the Federation. This was at a time when Louis XVI is already a quasi-prisoner at the Tuileries. It's before he tries to escape to Varennes. And he is seen here taking the oath that he, you know, will be king of the French, you know, not the French king, but king of the French, which is different. It's a kind of constitutional monarchy. And up here we have Marie Antoinette with the Dauphin. Now, this was a massive organisation. There was something like 500,000 people who came from this. They came up from every section of France. They were all dressed in special uniforms. They were put into groups where people singing had to be sort of coordinated. So he had mass choirs. He had massive processions. All of this was organised by David. Quite an extraordinary take. Now, these were very, very important, these festivals, because it was the way in which people could experience the revolution and experience themselves as citizens. It's all very well to know that, you know, particularly at this time of the Festival of the Supreme Being, which took place after the death of Louis XVI on the scaffold, it was very easy to see that, you know, read that the king was dead and that the nobility had fled. But what did that actually mean? Well, if you took part in these processions, you know, massed processions, dressed in the right paraphernalia, singing the right songs, all lifting hands in oaths to the right people, you had this feeling that you belonged to something, that you were no longer suppressed. You were part of the revolution and part of these ideas that you were transporting to the rest of the world. So Robespierre was again, a clever person who realized that the people couldn't exist without some kind of religion, you know, and in fact, Napoleon later on says religion's what keeps the masses from massacring their superiors. So Robespierre has the idea of the supreme being. You know, it's no longer really God, it's no longer a Christian religion, it's this almost Platonic idea of God. And so here we have, again, an extraordinary mass happening with the choirs and so on. And here we actually have an altar to the fatherland with the tree of liberty, with the Phrygian cap, and up here the supreme being, and down here we have the sort of altar of the supreme being, where you have Talleyrand, who will come along, who's already a bishop, and Robespierre will give the blessing. And the way in which it was organised, that people would sing or make the oath, and that would be carried to the next group of people who would repeat the oath, which would, so like they didn't have microphones, and so this would carry out to the 750,000 people who had come up to take part in this. So David had organised and sketched the costumes, and here we have the Feast of the Supreme Being, which was also pyrotechnical at the time, along as people marched towards, you know, to massing themselves in the Champ de Mars. They were all in the correct kind of costumes, as you can see, red, white and blue. There were statues which would combust, and underneath would be revealed a statue of the goddess of reason, for example. So it was really sound and fury and music and theatre and dancing, and then feasting, which also must have been an extraordinary coup, you know, to feed all of these people in Paris, and to find somewhere for most of them to stay. I just wanted to very quickly show that this did not go unnoticed by the Nazis, and in particular by Goering and with Spears, who was the great architect of the Nazi regime, who orchestrates the Nuremberg rallies. And here, at the last minute, they didn't quite know how to illuminate them, and so he turns the anti-aircraft lights up into the sky, so it turns into a cathedral of light. Must have been absolutely extraordinary, but you've got the same idea with hundreds of thousands of people all saluting the Führer. So not very different from the Feast of the Supreme Being with Robespierre. Well, I now want to get on, haven't got very much time, I've got to keep moving, constructing the image. So Napoleon now has this idea that if he wants to construct an image of himself, and he decides that he will be crowned, make himself emperor, and he wants to have himself consecrated. It wasn't just enough to call yourself empire by, an edict. He wants a massive ceremony to celebrate this. He commissions David to do a series of 4 paintings. This is the distribution of the eagles, also all these things that happened on the day of the consecration, and the arrival at the Hôtel de Ville, which David never got around to painting at all. And the 4th one was the enthroning, which he didn't even sketch. He managed, David, it takes him 3 years, as I said, to do this, but he also pictures himself in the tribunes there, sketching as the ceremony took place. In fact, he didn't really need to do this very much because he had enlisted the help of many of his pupils. This is Isabelle, who worked out the uniforms. And he and David worked with little wax figurines, working out the choreography, exactly where people should stand, what they should be wearing, what gestures they should make, and so on. So this is the high point of David's extraordinary career as a portraitist and as a kind of metteur en scène, or scenario, what's the word? Someone who organizes festivals. Originally, Napoleon was going to have himself crowning himself. In fact, he actually does crown himself with the Pope just sitting there, as we'll see. But David, in consultation with Napoleon, says that this is not a good idea. It looks too arrogant and it looks too awkward. And so it is decided that it will be the moment when he crowns Josephine. It takes place on a freezing day, on the 2nd of December, and it is in Notre Dame. And this is very important because when the kings of France had been crowned, or all coronation ceremonies had taken place at Reims or Reims, where they would be anointed with the sacred oil, and where they would then be the sort of conduit of the divine right of kings. Napoleon doesn't think this is a good idea, first of all, because of course he doesn't come from one of the great dynasties, and also because it is much better from a propaganda point of view to be in the center of Paris, where people can come and see him more easily. And so the cathedral is changed, sort of papier-mâché, or constructions are put up outside with royal symbols, and the same sort of thing constructed on the back, so that when the procession arrived, he could change into his royal robes. Now, he was inspired for this by another coronation, which was the coronation of Marie de Medici, when she became regent of France. And so here you see it's a very similar painting with this diagonal, which is going to go up to the right. Now, Napoleon desperately wanted to encode in this image the ideas that he wanted to put forward. And the first one was that he was being consecrated by no one less than the Pope. Now, when the kings of France were consecrated, it was by a bishop, not the Pope. Napoleon wants the highest person brought so that he can then compare himself to Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne, remember we saw on the rocks his name when he was going over the Alps. Charlemagne was the sort of original Frankish ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. And so Napoleon wants to incorporate these ideas into his image. So he wants then to be crowned by the pontiff himself. Now, the painting is divided very carefully. First of all, the different surfaces. Here we have the first level here, which is up close up, then you have the middle level, and then you have the back level here. Now, it is divided in the middle by this cross. And that is very, very carefully worked out, because Napoleon was now trying to coordinate his family, the secular group, the Bonapartes and his generals over here, with the religious group over here. So in his person, when he is being blessed, or has been blessed by the Pope, and he is already crowned and he's crowning Josephine, he is the connecting point between secular and religious France. And in fact, this is reinforcing the fact that even though he thought that, particularly Christianity was really rather ridiculous, he brought back Christianity in the Concordat of 1801, brought it back as one of the main religions in France. And the Pope agreed to actually come to this ceremony, hoping that he could persuade Napoleon to make more concessions to the Catholic Church. Of course, he didn't. So anyhow, this is why it's organized around that cross. So I want to actually look at these other people here who he wishes to continue his legacy. And you'll see how extraordinarily interwoven this family he is. So on one side, we have Joseph. We have Louis Joseph, his elder brother. We have Caroline, his younger sister, Pauline, Elisa, his eldest sister, Josephine's daughter, Hortense, and her little boy, Napoleon, who will be adopted by Napoleon but will die, and the wife of Joseph. So I just wanted to very quickly look at the Napoleonic family. So here we have the mother, who is married at 14 and dies at 85, would you believe? I think she produces something like about 13 or 14 children, only 8 of whom will survive. So here we have Joseph, who will be at the coronation, Napoleon, who's only something like 17 months younger than his elder brother. The third in line is Lucien, who won't be there because he's in exile, in disgrace, because he's married someone who Napoleon doesn't approve of. The next one is Maria Elisa, who will become, as we'll see, Duchess. Then we have Louis, who is also there. Pauline, who is there, Caroline, who's there, but Jerome, who is not there, who will be in America also because he has not obeyed his brother. So I just want to have a look at how Napoleon used his family. This is very quick because I'm running out of time. This is Louis, who Napoleon marries off to Josephine's daughter by her first marriage. Remember, Josephine de Beauharnais was already married, had 2 children. Her husband is executed. And by the way, David is one of the people who votes for the Beauharnais execution. So Napoleon, knowing or thinking that he's not being, Joseph, or he can't have any children, decides that he will adopt probably the child of his brother Louis and Hortense, who is his stepdaughter. However, the child that he thought he'd adopt would die, and by the time he gets round to looking at the next child of that marriage, he will know that he can have children of his own. So he makes Louis King of Holland. So that's already, I just want to show the way. And when he conquers Europe, he puts his family in position. Joseph, the eldest, quite a calm sort of person, will be first of all placed as King of Naples, and then that taken from Naples and becomes King of Spain. He's King of Spain during the time of the Goya paintings, of the uprising there, the hatred of the French. His kingship there will be a rather unhappy one. Now, he marries the sister of Napoleon's first sweetheart, Désirée, who then will go on and marry another one of Napoleon's rivals, who we'll have a look at in one of the paintings. So it's a very close-knit group. We then have Caroline, who is the youngest, very tempestuous, difficult to control person. Napoleon has a lot of difficulty with her. She will eventually betray her brother by allowing the British into the Bay of Naples at the time of Waterloo. She was much more concerned with her own maintaining her own title as Queen of Naples, and she is married off to Napoleon's crack cavalry commander, Murat, who we'll see in a moment. His favourite sister and Pauline, known as one of the most beautiful women in Europe, is also married off to one of his crack generals, Leclerc, and they are both sent off to quell the uprising of Toussaint Louverture in what is now Haiti. Leclerc dies of yellow fever. When this rather beautiful lady comes back, Napoleon has her married to the Prince Borghese. So in other words, if he's not creating crowns of Europe for them, he is actually marrying them into aristocracy. And she is the most faithful to him. She will go into exile with him on the island of Elba and petitions constantly the British to allow to go to St. Helena, and when he goes, gives him all her jewellery to spend. His eldest sister, who is the most like him, a great organizer, not a great beauty, however, is Mariana, known as Elisa. She becomes Princess of Lucca, and does the same sort of thing in Florence and Tuscany as Napoleon did in Paris. She sets up orphanages, she sets up universities, and so on. So coming back, so these are the people on this side of the painting. Now, if we go to just behind them, this is Joachim Murat, who is married to Caroline, the Queen of Naples. And here he's one of the great marshals of empire as well. And he was the person who was holding the crown of Josephine. Now here he is, he will become King of Naples, extraordinarily courageous, one of the greatest cavalry commanders of the heavy cavalry of all time. But also a bit flaky in his loyalty to Napoleon. Now I want to actually have a look over here at these people, and here we have the clergy. Now Pope Louis was brought out, as I said, more or less against his will. He wasn't imprisoned exactly, but he was kept under great watch. He was installed in the early on in the cathedral, which it was, freezing cold. All the women had been ordered not to cover themselves up. They were in those flimsy, bare-shouldered dresses, and I think the chattering of teeth must have, been hard to cover, even with the Te Deum Mass. But anyhow, what happens to the poor old Pope is that he is told by Napoleon, I am going to crown myself, so I'm not expecting you to bless me as I do that. And the Pope acquiesces and doesn't bless him. He just sort of sits there looking a bit actually dejected. The person who's pulled off this coup is in fact Napoleon's uncle, Cardinal Fesch. So you can see it's a very tight family group. Now, we also on this side have Josephine's other child, Eugène de Beauharnais, and we have Talleyrand, who was the sort of one of the great diplomats of the time who managed it. He's a bishop. He's got a bit of a limp, which is why he becomes a bishop and not someone who is in the army. He manages to survive and thrive from the revolution, where he's the person who, does the blessing under Robespierre, good heavens. He then becomes the right-hand man or the great diplomat of the Napoleonic regime, however, betrays Napoleon. Napoleon has difficulty with him. In fact, Napoleon has this pithy statement, you're nothing but shit in a silk stocking. He then, after Napoleon demise. He is one of the people who orchestrates the return of the Bourbon. He manages to survive through Charles X. He then also survives in the Orleans kingship. So he is not the great turncoat exactly, but he is someone who maneuvers very well. This is Eugène, who I was talking about, who is the stepson of Napoleon, the son of Josephine. Napoleon was very close to his stepchildren. He actually adopted Eugène as his son, but not as his heir. I can't remember exactly why. There he is, and he is made Viceroy of Italy. Now, I want to actually have a look at the people in the centre. We have, of course, the diagonal that goes up through the body of Josephine. Now, of course, Josephine de Beauharnais, as you know, was 6 or 7 years older than Napoleon. It looked as though she had undergone some trauma when she was in prison, but it looked as though she could no longer bear any children. And she managed to tell Napoleon that, look, I've got 2, it's obviously your fault. Well, Caroline, Napoleon's sister, who hated the old bag, as they called Josephine, managed to set her brother up with one of her ladies in waiting who will bear him a child, and then he also has a child with Walewski. So he realizes that he can have children. In fact, they were both sons. So he decides that for the good of France and for the good of the dynasty, he must divorce her, even though he remained very fond of her. And when she maintains her title of sort of Dowager Empress. It is 4 years after this crowning that the marriage is dissolved. Now, he wanted to crown her because he felt that they had been through a lot together. Here we have Napoleon, the central, pillar of this particular painting, and we'll look at the symbols in a moment. The omissions and inclusions, well, the person who actually wasn't there, it's not actually an accurate history of what really went on, is Madame Mother. Now, Madame Mother was pretty annoyed because everyone else, her children, her little brats, as she called them sometimes, all were kings or queens or viceroys, and she really didn't have any titles. So she was given the title of Madam Mother of the Emperor, but no one ever called her that because it was too long, and she just got Madam Mother. So she wasn't all that happy about that. And also she had a favourite son who was Lucien, remember, the one who got Napoleon out of difficulty, who had also gone against his brother by marrying a woman who was not of royalty and having a number of children and refusing to divorce her. Napoleon wanted to use all of his brothers and sisters as pawns in this game of setting up this network of Napoleonides or Bonapartes throughout Europe. Lucien refused to actually cooperate in this game, and Madame Mother took his part, and they lived in Rome together, so she wasn't there. Napoleon said to David, too bad, paint her in anyhow. The other thing that was inaccurate was that Napoleon had told his sisters, the 3 of them, that they all had to carry the train of Josephine, which was extremely heavy. They had an absolute fit. There was screaming and shouting and tantrums, and particularly from Caroline. And the brother, Joseph, the elder brother, got involved, and Napoleon actually came in and said, now listen, you either do that or all of your crowns will be taken from you. So there's a bit of grumbling, and they actually carried her train. And the story is that as she mounts the steps, which were quite steep, they let it go, and she very, very nearly fell over backwards. She had to right herself. It could have been an absolute disaster. So when the painting is actually made, the sisters prevail, showing that 2 other ladies in waiting are actually carrying the train, and they are regally on the side. They don't want to be walking in the train of the old nut. Also, you have over here the Turkish ambassador, who would not really have been in the cathedral because he's a Muslim. However, Napoleon wanted him brought in because he thought Islam was a worthy religion, in fact, more sensible than Christianity. The other thing which was done was that Josephine by now did not look like this. She was considerably older. She'd been through quite a bit during the Revolution, and gravity had set in. But however, she has been airbrushed here to look as though she's about 20. The other thing that we have here is Napoleon actually places this head of Julius Caesar here to actually mask the original painting of himself crowning himself. Now, I want to very quickly look through these symbols. I'm sorry, I've gone a bit over time. The symbols were very important, in particular the bee and the eagle that he's going to use. Now, if you look at these images, you can see these beautiful trains covered in bees here. On Napoleon's mantle, you see bees surrounded here by laurel wreaths, which are going to refer to ancient Rome. And also the inside of Notre Dame was camouflaged with curtains and paintings and silks and embroidered, and here you have the bees. This was because the cathedral had been degraded during the time of the Revolution and did not look fit for a coronation. So it looked very much like an opera box, you know, with all of these boxes with people sitting in them. Now, on the right-hand side, you have symbols here. You have the eagle, the hand of justice, and the orb. And so here we have them again. Now, these were, in many ways, the symbols, the secular symbols, and they're held by the former consuls. These are the two men who were the consuls, do you remember, with Napoleon. Only now they've become arch-treasurer and arch-chancellor, and Berthier was one of the great generals. Now, here we have the eagle of the legions. You know, Napoleon is going to use the eagle because he takes it from the Roman legions, as he's going to see himself as an emperor, not a king, like the Roman emperors, Augustus, and in particular Julius Caesar, even though he didn't become emperor. So you have the Roman symbols, the hand of justice, which, you know, it means he has the power of law, and here the orb showing that he has power over the earth. Now, on the other side, so that's the secular symbols. Over here, he has given the symbols of royalty to his family. So here you have the crown of Charlemagne, the scepter of Charlemagne, see Charlemagne up on the scepter, and the sword, the joyeuse sword as well. And Napoleon is wearing a replica of the sword as himself. Napoleon has the crown made, and it still exists today. It's one of the few things that you can actually go and see in the Louvre. Now, when Napoleon has himself crowned, he doesn't crown himself with that. He crowns himself with the golden wreath. Now, this is made of pure gold, designed by David and Isabelle. 44 leaves, 43 berries, some of them are detachable because it was very heavy. Of course, it refers to ancient Rome. The Roman generals, when they came back from a triumph, wore this on their head. It was seen as the wreath of victory, and this is where you get the baccalaureate, you know, when you graduate in France, that's the name of where graduation, poets wore it. So here he's very much the emperor, right? And that's why he's using it rather than a crown. He also has himself side on, because this is the way in which the Roman emperors had themselves replicated on the coins that they disseminated throughout Europe. Here he is in the moment of crowning Josephine. Here is the image that David will paint of him. I think a very good likeness. He has very pale skin and sort of grey-blue eyes. He also is encoded in this. It's not a symbol. Those symbol. Oh, I didn't actually tell you why he used the bees. Yes, well, the bees were used because at this particular time, a tomb had been unearthed. It was the tomb of the Merovingian kings. This was the first dynasty of France. And in this tomb had been found a sort of rather powdered cicada. So Napoleon assumes this insect as his because he wants to inscribe himself in a dynasty, the most ancient dynasty of the Frankish kings. But he turns it into a bee, and the bee, because of course it's immortal and it's all of these things, it's industrious. And so that is why he insists so much on having the bee buzzing throughout his cloaks and throughout his carpets everywhere. But he also actually wants to put on show to all of the diplomats who come to the crowning the greatness of French industry, the artisan industry. France, again, he wants to take over that role that Versailles had of setting this, the rules of etiquette, of setting the rules for court dress, of setting the rules of, if you want the finest lace, you buy it from France. If you want the finest jewels, you buy it from France. So this is what he is going to do with Josephine in particular. So here we have this, the jewels that we have at this crowning are extraordinary, and I haven't really got time to go into this, but he gave thousands of francs to each of his family members and to the women who were going to be particularly on show, so that they would have beautiful, unusual tiaras, all of which would reflect on some aspect of his reign. Some of his sisters have cameos in their tiaras reflecting, again, ancient Rome. They all have extraordinary necklaces which go with the tiaras, earrings, brooches, rings. He wanted the entire interior of Notre Dame to be sparkling with the glint of these precious stones. So Josephine has made this beautiful tiara, which she wears very low on her forehead, very gracefully, and has the comb here. So when he crowns her, he puts the crown on top of all of this, which is very heavy for her. Now, this is this extraordinary, beautiful tiara. Is it a tiara or a... Yes, it is a tiara. With I don't know how many diamonds. It no longer is on display in the Louvre, because most of the crown jewels, first of all, many of them disappeared at the time of the Revolution. Many of them were found again, but again, many of the jewels were then melted down when the Bourbons came back to power. Louis XVIII, for example, has great joy in melting Napoleon's gold leaf crown. However, one leaf has been found and has actually been auctioned for a fortune just recently. So royal jewels either disappeared then, were melted down, were made, remodeled for, the dynasty that came back. But in 1887, when finally France comes through all of these revolutions and dynasties that come and go, and finally brings forward the Third Republic. The Republic does not want to have jewels and crown jewels that remind people of its sort of ancien regime and of all of these returns of the Bourbon and so on. And so at a massive sale, they sell off most of the crown jewels. Charlemagne's crown that Napoleon uses remains because it's sort of a symbol of the history of France. But this one is sold to the Americans, to Arpels. Tiffany buy a huge number of them, and many of these crowns are taken apart. This one was lent to Princess Grace for one of the ceremonies in which she takes part. She wears it incorrectly, I suppose. Was made to be worn low on the forehead, and this is what Josephine made popular. But because she's so beautiful, it looks all right. You wonder whether people actually choose their consorts because of their good looks and their ability to wear jewellery and to look the part. Anyway, when Napoleon dies finally on the island of St. Helena, we are left then with this immense painting, which survives to this day. In fact, there are two copies of it. There's one at Versailles and there's one in the Louvre. And so what he was attempting to achieve in his lifetime did not perhaps come about, but through his ideas of propaganda that he pursued throughout his lifetime, he has managed to ensure that the legend that he was creating has stayed alive. And indeed, if we were privileged enough to be able to be in France at the moment, we would be able to go to these huge number of celebrations of his death on the 5th of May 2021, and see the homage which is still being paid to this great man. Would he have still been so much in our minds had he not been so good at creating his own image? And as he says, glory is fleeting, obscurity is eternal.